was able to write for the President's Daily Brief. I tried to write about one topic that was probably too important for a first-time author to try to tackle. The system kind of rejected us trying to step into this really important central energy issue. Look at AI, there's the compute issues, algorithms, data, but then there's the infrastructure, energy, water, that attends all of this. And that's become a fundamentally important issue that's raised the profile of energy again.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this very interesting conversation. I'm here with a very special guest, a distinguished individual within the field of national security. He worked for the Department of Energy, and he also started his career at Amazon, and he did various things within the field of national security. So Manolis, it's great to sit down with you. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Cassian. I'm really pleased to be part of the conversation and to have learned more about your organization recently, and glad to be talking to you here in Whitefish, Montana.
What made you, let's just say, enter the field of national security? It's sometimes a bit of a secretive world out there. So how come you changed from Amazon, from the private field, until the public field?
Yeah, so I had a somewhat circuitous pathway into national security, and just recently retired after more than 20 years in the U.S. government. When I was in my late 20s, early 30s, at one point my mother said to me, "It's like, I've always known that you've had a plan." I'm like, "Well, I'm glad one of us thought I had a plan." So when I graduated from college in the mid-90s, I went traveling in Eastern Europe, just went backpacking in Eastern Europe, and I came back. I was in Russia for a while, and this is in 1996. Was in the Balkans, just sort of like wandering around. Ended up being about 6 months or so. And got back to Washington State, where I grew up, and ended up just deciding to move to Seattle for a number of reasons. Had some friends, and just made the decision to go up there. And this is late '96, and literally just dumb luck, bumped into somebody I had gone to high school with, who was working in a temp agency. Who I said I was looking for a job, and she was not a temp; she was working in the temp agency. And she said, "Well, what do you know about books?" I was like, "Well, I was an English major." She goes, "What about the internet?" I'm like, "Well, I had an email address." This is 1996. I was like, "I had an email address for the last year of my time in college." She said, "Good enough. Come down and apply." So it turned out it was Amazon. They were hiring temps, and it was temp to hire. So I ended up starting at Amazon in late '96. I spent a year and a quarter, and in 1998. Through a confluence of events, I was working on a graveyard project and was listening to the Czech-Russian gold medal hockey game from Japan in 1998. And the Czechs won, and somebody said, I was listening to the radio live on the graveyard show, they said, "I bet the people in Wenceslas Square are going crazy right now." This is 1998. I'm like, oh, maybe there's a webcam view of Old Town Square, Václavský náměstí in Prague right now. And so I was like, maybe I can find that view. Couldn't find it, but I kept finding this one website that was covering Central Europe. And they were looking for somebody who had some skills that I had. I sent an email to them. Literally by the next morning, I was on my way to Prague. I made the decision to go to Prague.
Before you got the job or after?
No, I got the job offer. So I sent them an email. The following morning, we had a conversation. Yes. Like at the end of my shift. We made the decision. I made the decision to take the job. And 2 or 3 weeks later, I was gone. I was off to Prague. So I always tell people that my decision to leave Amazon in 1998 should not be taken as a referendum on my decision-making capacity. I used to joke that, the heady days of 1998, people were lining up to throw money at bad ideas, and I had no shortage of bad ideas. So I moved out to Prague. I was working for this internet company. One thing led to another. I ended up deciding to move to London to work for another startup. Didn't exactly pan out as planned. I got hired by another startup. There was a U.S. company that was opening their European operations. Did that for about a year and a half, and then the U.S. company died in the internet bubble. That brought the European company down, but I was a local hire, so I ended up getting a severance package. So what I did, and I know this is a lengthy narrative, but what I did, I took that money a bunch of stuff in my life was happening all at the same time. I was like, you know what, I'm going to go travel for a bit. So I went from Cairo to Istanbul, and then from Istanbul to Beijing over land. Did it over about 8 months. Landed back, and then literally flew from Beijing to back to Washington State. Went to my sister's wedding. Saw a friend in Chicago, a friend in New York. Flew back to London. So did a round the world trip.
Amazing.
And it sort of reignited my interest in national security. So I ended up was still doing some freelance writing, doing some things, still frankly living off my severance package in London, and reconnected with a friend from college who then became girlfriend, fiance, now wife.
Amazing.
She was in DC. I made the decision to come back to go to grad school in DC, and then got hired into the Department of Energy out of grad school in a program called the Presidential Management Fellowship Program, which sadly is no longer, was closed by OPM in the last year, but was an intake program for people from graduate programs into the federal government. So it was a sort of circuitous route, yes. But the thing that really was sort of an inflection point was the internet company going out of business, and that travel sort of reignited my interest in frankly, the world and international affairs. Several months in Central Asia, in the Caucasus. Yes. I spent 3 weeks in Iran, and a lot of things that, frankly, I'm glad I didn't know then what I know now, because I probably wouldn't have gone to some of those places and done some of the things I did. But it all worked out and sort of helped bring me to where I am now. But so I went into the Department of Energy, spent a little time in the policy office, did a detail assignment to the Pentagon, and thought about staying at the Pentagon, but had an opportunity to go back to the Department of Energy's Intel office. And one of the reasons I ended up making that decision, and people were surprised at the time that I did it, was that, and this is not entirely fair, but this is my conception at the time, I felt like I could see my pathway for the next 20 years at DoD. And that if I went back to DOE, I couldn't see it. And I actually found that to be exciting. Okay. That there was going to be opportunities to do different things. And whereas obviously there are opportunities to do different things at the Pentagon in OSD policy, but I felt like there was a predictable pathway. I looked at the people around me, all great people, wonderful patriots doing really important good work, but I was like, okay, I can see how their career paths went, yes. And I'm not sure that's what I want to do. And a way going back to DOE was was into the unknown. And frankly, it then was an opportunity to do different things. Those opportunities came up, and I pursued them and was able to have what I think was an interesting and varied career, but unusual in a lot of national security pathways that people take.
Well, thank you very much for sharing. I think that was very interesting. Before we get into the Department of Energy, I would like that we briefly just speak about your travels, right? So when you were traveling around these different countries, you mentioned Central Asia, I mean, everywhere, right? Even Egypt, etc. What did you do in those times? I'm guessing, of course, you explored the culture, etc. Did you try to learn the language, or did you take pictures? How did your day-to-day look like? I mean, you spent weeks on end, right? Months.
Yeah. No, it was from February of 2001 to September of 2001. And it was, and I fully recognize, I arrived back into London the first week of September. Okay. And, I remember the day I got back, actually it was the day England beat Germany 5-2 in a European Championship qualifier, I believe. Or was it a World Cup qualifier?
World Cup or?
World Cup, it was, I remember that was the night we went out to the pub. That was like the day I got back. And then it was not long after, you have September 11th, yes. And I think all the things that I had done in Central Asia would have been impossible, like at that point. Yes. So no, I had, when I went through security clearance process, I got asked a lot of questions about the travel. I mean, the saving grace was I wasn't doing anything bad. I was just going to sites, spent a lot of time trying to talk to people. I had done some long haul travel in '96 through, like I said, in Russia and Eastern Europe. And in some ways a little bit timid. I felt a little bit more bold during the second trip. And that's just where, like, I'm a big supporter of long haul backpacking and travel for sort of, exploration of the world, but also self exploration. I do wonder now how it works because you can effectively stream it, right? Like when I was out and, you bump into the same Australians all over the place, but otherwise you're on your own. And in my first long haul trip, like if you wanted to make a long distance call in Russia, you had to go and make an appointment at the post office and to get a long distance line. And the second time you started to see internet cafes in places like Osh in Kyrgyzstan. So it was a little bit easier to connect. But no, I was, hitting the big sites. I didn't have any reservations. So anytime I went someplace, I have to find someplace to stay. And, it's one of those things where, I got invited to somebody's house for dinner in Kazakhstan once. And I remember, my first time doing travel like that, I was probably a little bit more reticent. This time I thought to myself, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? I could get kidnapped and murdered.
Yes.
That's probably not going to happen. So, okay,
it'd be
fine.
a good story.
Let's go. Yeah. So, and there were things. I had some hairy moments. There was a afternoon in Turkmenistan that got a little complicated. There was another.
What happened there?
So I was in the eastern part of Turkmenistan. You weren't allowed to go south into Afghanistan, or even go near the Turkmen-Afghan border. And I was in I think it was Charhuz in eastern Turkmenistan. I'm looking at the train timetable, and there's option either go north to Konya-Urgench, which is a historic old city, or on the Uzbek Turkmen border, or you could go south. Well, you can't go south because I was restricted from going south. So I'm looking at the timetable, and somebody clocked me as a foreigner, and I suspect it was my boots. That was one thing I was told later, that I looked pretty rough, and had learned a bit of Russian by that point and was getting around with some basic Russian. But I had some nice hiking, Meindl, German hiking boots, and they were I think they spotted me as okay, that guy's a foreigner. And so I got pulled aside by the police and questioned and detained, and they took my passport and they wrecked my passport because they were trying to figure out if it was fake, and they managed to separate the picture from the page. I'm and then they tried to fix it by pasting it on themselves. Yeah. I'm oh my gosh!
So you had to go to the consulate or
so I had to go deal with passport issues and all sorts of stuff. But so there's things like that where you just don't know. I got pulled aside in the Baku metro in Azerbaijan, and there have been problems. There have been bombings by the Lezgin minority or attributed to the Lezgin minority in the north. So I was carrying a backpack, and I got pulled aside on the Baku metro. And I got pulled into this secondary search, and I had 3 bags, I had some day packs packed inside my bag, and I had 3 people pulling everything out of my bags all at once, and that was where I thought, okay, this is where I'm going to have a problem, because this is where they're going to if they want to plant something on me, I can't watch everything they're doing right now.
Yes.
And if they want to do that, they could do that right away. So. Luckily, it didn't happen, but it was a 6-hour ordeal, and just crossing borders, you never know. But no, it was wonderful. I'd spent a lot of time talking to people. I talked to people in Syria about the situation. The Syrians were very nervous about talking. Iranians opened up very quickly about what they thought about the United States, what they thought about their own government, what they thought about others. So it was fascinating to get those perspectives. But otherwise, it was going to Samarkand in Uzbekistan and not only seeing the ancient part of the city, the old part of the city, but also the sort of more contemporary Soviet city that's behind it.
Yes.
just understanding how people live in places like that are, really culturally and ethnically diverse. You have Russians, you have Tajik speakers, you have Uzbek, national identity. It just was fascinating to learn about the places. And the biggest, towards the end, I ended up spending 3 weeks in Xinjiang in northwest China, where the Uyghurs live, and going to places like Kashgar and Urumqi, and sort of just understanding some of those dynamics as well.
Yes.
So it was, like I said, I learned a lot about the region. I learned a lot about what was going on, and frankly, I learned about how I wanted to sort of operate in the world as well. So I did get accused a couple of times of being a spy. I was not. I remember crossing the Kazakh-Chinese border, and I had a map. I had a map of China, and I had a GPS device. So in retrospect, I probably looked a little suspicious. I looked pretty grubby. I had a beard, and these Kazakh border guards were like, "All right, we're going to let you go, but we know you're a spy, and the Chinese are just going to take all this stuff from you. So why don't you just give it to us now?" And I think they just wanted it.
The GPS.
The GPS device,
Yeah.
and even the maps. They're like, "Oh, these are good maps," and they were like, "Why don't you just give them to us? Because the Chinese are just going to take them from you." It's like, well, how about I just take that chance?
Yes.
And they're like, "Oh, okay,
They
fine."
let you go.
They let me go. So it was the longest, harshest, friendliest interrogation that I ever went through. These guys were like, I think was also just curious, they hadn't had anybody like me turn up, at least for some time. And they were just I was a curiosity, like everybody came around and asked me questions, and they took my passport and literally went through all the stamps in the visas and mapped it out. They had a map of Central Asia, and they were like, "Okay, you crossed here and here and here and here and here and here." And they're like, "Well, why didn't you cross here instead of there?" I'm like, "Well, okay, I wanted to go to." They're like, "Why didn't you cross from Kyrgyzstan into Kazakhstan here? Why did you go all the way out there?" I was like, "Oh, I wanted to go out to Issyk-Kul, the lake." And they're like, "Oh, okay, that makes sense." And
you're traveling with the train always?
No, very rarely on that trip on train. From Turkmenistan, where I had that problem at the train station, was one of the places where I did take the train. For the most part, it was on buses, flagging down a ride. There are places, in particular in the Middle East, where you go to the bus station and there would be people who would be driving from point A to point B, and they would just be looking for somebody to sit in the car, pay something that kind of contributes to gas, and then I think that's what gets them from one place to another. Because the Soviets effectively had a hub and spoke train system, right? They didn't necessarily want people to be able to go east-west. So you can get from Ashgabat to Tashkent by train, but you got to go by way of Moscow to do that. There's no east-west line. So that's where you have to go however you can get there. I bumped into this one guy, this Australian, who said he managed to go from Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan to Ust-Kamenogorsk, someplace else in the north, on horseback. And
Wow.
the one thing I always kind of regret is I never was able to say that I went. I did ride horses in Kyrgyzstan.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
up in the mountains. Wow. And I mean, like the sort of crass American I can be at times, every time we crested a hill, I would do it to the Bonanza theme song. So I taught all these Kyrgyz kids the Bonanza theme song. But that was the only time I didn't get to go from one city to another on horseback. But no, it was a fascinating time, a wonderful trip, really formative for me. And I also do think it would be very, very difficult to do these days. Maybe a little bit easier now.
Yes.
Especially like the Fergana Valley, the Bekaa Valley, places like that, I think would be trouble.
From my analysis, you're a anthropologist at heart, right?
Maybe so.
You want to understand the different societies, how they interact, their culture. So then you get into the Department of Energy, right? What was your focus area there, and was it linked to your societal exploration that you did in Asia, or was that just a personal?
No, it ended up being, there ended up being a connection. So I moved in first into the policy office, so the oil and gas energy policy office, working Western Hemisphere issues, in particular Canada, Mexico, and Venezuela.
Interesting.
And so I was effectively the backup, the support to a really wonderful officer, Andrea Lockwood, who was the lead on Venezuela. It was early in my career, and it was right when Chavez was expropriating the oil fields from U.S. companies.
Yes.
It was also happening in Ecuador, where the Occidental assets were being expropriated. There was just all of that was going on. You had the changes in government in Bolivia. So it was an interesting time to be watching Latin American energy issues. Problems between Argentina and Chile, the Caribbean desk officer at the OSD, Office of Secretary of Defense for Policy,
Really?
but also working Venezuela and Cuba issues. And so it's been interesting to watch all of the things that have been in the news in the last several months, especially related to Venezuela. That was my portfolio 20 years ago, was like understanding what was happening in the oil industry in Venezuela, and then also military issues. I actually wrote a paper at one point that, I don't want to get into the paper, but so we were watching these things quite closely. So I then had an opportunity, because the program I was in allowed you to move from one, it was an amazing program, the Presidential Management Fellowship Program, because it allowed you at the end of the 2 years to move non-competitively to really any place you wanted to go. And in the US government, non-competitive move is an amazing thing, because it means you can just be selected to do it, right? You don't have to go through an application process. And this is where I was going to go to the Pentagon. I actually accepted a job to go to the Pentagon. There were problems with the pay package and the offer, and it took months for them to fix it. In the meantime, the intelligence office at DOE came in, and I was talking to them, and they're like, look, the guy who ran the oil and gas office was like, look, I've just been given the opportunity to hire somebody. You want to come and work for me? I can give you a promotion ladder that's going to be better than what you can get at the Pentagon, and it would be great to come in. So I was like, that's one of the reasons.
They were fighting for you.
One of the reasons why I was like, I see the pathway in the Pentagon. I think this is going to be interesting, exciting, opportunity to build something. I kind of felt like I developed a bit of an entrepreneurial outlook from Amazon, and I'm like, this is an opportunity to grow a team. And we did that. I was able to write for the President's Daily Brief. I wrote the first solo-authored article our office had ever contributed to the PDB.
How was that?
Well, it was an experience, and it was also kind of this formative experience. I tried to write about one topic that was probably too important for a first-time author to try to tackle, and the system kind of rejected us trying to step into this really important central energy issue.
Can you say what it was? Or?
I can't really say what it was, but it was something that was like core to the energy world. And even though the analysis was good, it was solid, the system kind of pushed us back. And, I talk about it now, like my response was maybe not the most mature, but my response was, okay, fine, it's on now. I'm going to figure out how to do this. And I realized that there were pathways into the publication through some peripheral issues that could be argued were actually central issues. And I ended up writing a large number of items for the PDB over the course of a year, and really pleased our leadership. Our team was allowed to grow a little bit more. We brought in some great people who did some additional wonderful work. We built our relationship with the other agencies. And what happened is I effectively got noticed by the PDB staff. And the way the PDB works is they hire people to be briefers for the customers of the PDB. And I applied to be a briefer to one of the cabinet members. I was brought in to do the interview, and something I said in the interview triggered something with the director of the PDB staff, who was a senior CIA officer and became a mentor and is still somebody I'm close with. And in the middle of the interview, something I said stopped him, and he said, "Actually, I want to explore something you just said." Okay. And it was about, like, how I would, I can't even remember what it was. It was like how I would structure, how I would deal with, you've got something that you're trying to brief, and then you realize that it's not good enough. Like, how do you deal with it? And he's like, I've just been given authority to hire an executive assistant / chief of staff type job. So he started asking me questions about that job. And I talked to people who were on the interview panel afterwards, and they were like, they were baffled about what was going on, because it started an interview for one job, and in the middle it stopped and started as an interview for another job. And then I think at the end he was like, "Oh, we got to go back and finish the original interview, so there's a couple more questions." So he called me up the next day. He's like, "Well, I got good news and bad news."
2 jobs.
And he says, the bad news. I said, "What do you want first?" I said, "What's the bad news?" He said, "The bad news is that we don't want to offer you the briefer job. The good news is I want to offer you this other job." And it ended up being, I was the first holder of the position of chief of staff of the President's Daily Brief staff. And it was the time of the Arab Spring. There was just so much going on. There was, James Clapper came in as DNI. Robert Cardillo was the deputy director for intelligence integration. And these were really landmark figures, I think, in the history of ODNI. And there was a fundamental change on how the briefing worked. One of the things I worked closely on was the transition of the PDB from paper to iPad. Met some wonderful people at different agencies who were, in particular at CIA, who were supportive, working on some related topics. And just, it was another sort of transformational moment. It gave me insight into the breadth and, frankly, depth of the community.
Yes.
Because everything kind of comes together there. And one of the things we were looking to do, this was 2011, was broaden the book, also bring in more agencies, so really take advantage of the breadth of expertise from across the community. So I was visiting Treasury, I was visiting NGA, I was talking to the Coast Guard, I was talking to all the agencies to try to figure out how can we support you to contribute more. And actually, one of the things I'm most proud of is that when I left that job, there were 3 different agencies that I got an award from for support to them from my perch at ODNI in helping them get greater access to the PDB, which I thought was I'm very proud of that, because there's wonderful work that's done at CIA, DIA, the big agencies that do the bulk of the contributions, but really fantastic expertise at these other agencies as well.
That's amazing, right? And I want that we go also to your experience in Venezuela, and that we speak about energy there, right? We see at the moment that energy is becoming more and more important. It was always very, very important, right? But now we see many countries have huge reserves of oil. Now, of course, we have the war in Iran, which pushed up many of the oil prices. So if we look at the world order as is, we see that many of the Western nations, the US included, Canada, Europe, perhaps we can include Mexico there as well, they have a certain type of political outlook, right? But then you look at other countries, which the US deems as competitors or enemies, right? Such as China, India perhaps, Russia, etc., Iran. So how do you view the role of energy within that huge equation?
So it's fundamental to, so energy is fundamental to the lifeblood economy of every single country in the world. I used to deal with the Caribbean, and places like that you just don't think about. there was like the Bahamas, for instance. They have I'm not sure they still do because I think they realized it's not a good idea. But they had like a single regulated price for the entire country. So
a
fixed price. So people in Nassau were paying the same as people on an island with like 100 people on it.
Yes.
And it's just really hard to sustain that sort of thing. But it's like actually I heard somebody compare intelligence to electricity. That the way policymakers look at it as intelligence is the same way that most people look at electricity. You flip the switch, you just want it to go on. You don't really care how it came about. You just want the lights to go on when you flip the switch. And the same thing, like we do a lot of like hand-wringing and for good reason, arguments and discussions about the way the intelligence process works. Policymakers just want it to show up and be able to have it be helpful, right? They don't really care like where it came from. The same thing with oil, right? It's this thing that's so fundamentally important to all of our lives, and most people will never see a drop of crude oil in their life, right? They just will never encounter the physical thing, but they encounter the outputs of it every moment. Like there's a half a dozen just like on this, in and around this table. So it's it's obviously fundamentally important. The dynamics have changed really dramatically in the United States. Look, one of the things that I always point to was that one of my first days at DOE in 2005, there was literally my first day at Department of Energy, there was a briefing by the head of legislative affairs to an all-hands meeting. That was just coincidental. That was the day I started. They had an all-hands meeting. Assistant secretaries, but they brought in the head of legislative affairs, and they had just gotten passage, I believe, of the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which was a landmark energy policy act, and landmark energy law. And one of the things that it did was give the federal government the authority to override local intransigence on approving LNG import facilities into the United States. This was in 2005. There were, I think there were 9 at the time and 1 that was about to be completed. So of those 10, by 2010, 2012, only I think 2 of them are still import facilities. The rest have been converted to export facilities. So it was and the reason that matters is because the dynamics on like oil and gas with fracking just really changed the U.S. production picture, and also means that Middle East imports become less important from a specific economic security perspective. Even in a way, Venezuela becomes less important. There's the Citgo refineries on the Gulf Coast that were tooled specifically for Venezuelan oil. That doesn't matter. But the dynamics have changed because of the fracking changes in the United States. So the reason I raise that is because in 2005, this was a Republican administration is willing to use the federal government's authority, give the federal government the authority to override state and local reluctance to approve a facility. Just years later, those facilities are not even import facilities anymore. They've been converted to export facilities.
Yes.
So I think that has changed the calculation in a lot of ways. That it changes how we look at the Middle East, how we look at Russia. But I spent a lot of time looking at European natural gas imports from Russia, and
yes.
Changes. What I think it's useful, especially for students. There's 2 things. One is to just understand the energy economy as a system, because when we were looking at like European imports of gas from Russia, we were also looking at the North African pipelines bringing gas into Europe, Norwegian gas coming into Europe, but also Qatari gas coming into Europe. And one of the things that we actually discussed was, what if there were, run through scenarios. What if there was some reason why the Japanese and the Koreans started importing more volumes of gas. And I remember having this discussion in late 2000s. It was like, well, why would that happen? It was like, well, maybe the Japanese make a decision to shut down their nuclear power industry. Like, oh, okay, that's not going to happen. Well, then they have the Fukushima earthquake, and they do that. And then that changes the gas dynamics, and you start to see more of an evolution of an international gas market. So just understanding it all as a system. The other example I always use is think about that's kind of remarkable is Chile. Right? Chilean, one of their key exports is copper. Right? There's the copper mines up in the north. Copper is an energy-intensive industry. The extraction of copper is electricity and energy intensive. And when they needed gas for the copper industry, where did they look? Okay, they could look at Argentina, but Argentina is kind of a challenge when it comes to gas production, consumption, deep subsidies for consumer prices. The Kirchners were doing all this. They could look to, abundant supplies of energy in Bolivia, but they're technically still at war with Bolivia from the 19th century, right? So they're not going to get any gas from Bolivia. The Chileans, there's the pathway to the sea. The Bolivians don't have one because of the conflict with the. I think they're technically still at war. Maybe that's finally been solved. Peruvians is not an option because they were dealing with everything. So where did they look? They create LNG import facilities to import gas from like Malaysia, Indonesia, and Australia. So you just have to think about how do these dynamics all come together. So that's the one thing. Energy as a system and how it undergirds so many different political and geopolitical decisions, but largely on economic terms. The other is for U.S. People interested in U.S. national security is to spend time understanding Canada and Mexico. They're so fundamentally important to our energy security picture. Even with the fracking, it's maybe not as exciting as the Middle East or China or someplace like that, but they're fundamentally important. And now, obviously, the other reason to spend a lot of time understanding energy dynamics is because of artificial intelligence and where the technology is going now. We look at AI, there's the compute issues, algorithms, data, but then there's the infrastructure, energy, water, that attends all of this. And that's become a fundamentally important issue that's raised the profile of energy again.
Like you mentioned, looking at perhaps the NAFTA agreement, or now it's called USMCA, right, is an important, in the end, the most important allies that the United States has, especially now being that with Europe, there seems to be a bit of a difficult conversation there. So if we now look at the future of things, I know that, for example, Russia and China, they now signed a new pipeline. I think it's called the Siberia 2. And which should help with providing energy, basically coming from Russia to China, right? And you see these, for them, allies, right, coming together. For the United States, of course, enemies, creating new contracts to function in a better fashion. In Latin America, you see the Chinese investing in the Belt and Road Initiative throughout, buying many ports, copper mines in Chile, and other very strategic reserves and very important things for said nations, right? Where the US perhaps fell behind within all of this. Now, if we look at the future of energy, being the fact as well that China has recently grown much more when it comes to renewable energy, how would you say the US should approach the future of energy? Do you think it should go more into the domain of renewables? Do you think it should go into more of the domain of perhaps even nuclear energy, right? Elaborating that even more, or should we continue with the fracking and try to drill more?
Well, it's a complicated question. So I served as a briefer for Rick Perry. Oversaw the briefings, intelligence briefings for Rick Perry when he was Secretary of Energy. He had been governor of Texas, and he was very proud of his he was explicitly proud of the oil and gas industry in Texas, but also the installation of wind and solar, and this sort of, at the time, what they were saying was sort of, we needed this all of the above approach. And there's the climate concerns that do come from the fossil fuel industry, and I frankly spent enough time with the scientists at the DOE labs to believe that all of that's true. It's kind of hard to believe I actually need to say that, but you do need to say that explicitly. We are in a situation where maintaining economic growth and prosperity does at the moment require this sort of all of the above approach. The fracking has been, like I said before, so fundamentally important to change the sort of import dynamics. I mean, the United States is now the largest oil producer in the world.
Self-reliant.
And an exporter, which is amazing. I mean, it's quite remarkable, actually, that they had to make legal changes to allow for exports of oil, because the idea was that you needed to be able to make sure that it was retained internally so that there wouldn't be shortages, or be able to manage prices. So nuclear is an interesting one. I spent a lot of time in and around the nuclear weapons complex, and one of the challenges we have is that the decline in the nuclear civil industry has impacted, the number of people who are coming out as nuclear engineers, nuclear physicists, and the resurgence of nuclear interest in nuclear, I think, is a good thing. We still have all the attendant problems on fuel supply, but also like where the uranium is going to come from, and how there's Centrus, the American centrifuge company, that is actually now delivering fuel for nuclear power plants. You still have all the attendant waste issues that have to be addressed. Then there's the promise of fusion. Right now, the sort of small modular reactor and Gen 4, there's like 50 different designs. There's not going to be 50 different designs that actually come to fruition. I mean, I'm not deep in this industry, but I also do recognize in particular, because of the need for increased power production for the AI industry and for data centers, we need a solution to deal with that. And I think the SMR fusion opportunities are probably where that growth will come from. There's a reason why the Department of Energy has actually put out proposals for people to build data centers, actually power and data on DOE facilities. So they're not in the communities, although they're not far from the communities because they're on the DOE labs, to try to see if there's a way to use the power of the government to generate this power that is needed. And the hard part is, how do you convince people to support a new data center in their area and a power plant in that area that they'll never get a single watt from? That's one of the big challenges. But if you look at what the amount of GPUs that companies like AI and Anthropic are buying, you need power to be able to make those data centers run. So I think there is a lot of support, a lot of focus on nuclear, and if we're going to get the kind of power supply that is projected we'll need, it's inevitably going to be a big part of it.
Perfect. So now I'll ask you one last question, then we can go to wrap it up for advice that you'd like to share for those that are perhaps listening, right? Now, a question I just needed to ask you was about an area I believe that is underexplored for many people, especially I'd say the average American, which is the Arctic, right? And currently in the Arctic, they say that around 50% of all oil that is unexplored in the whole world is based in the Arctic. They say around 30% of all natural gas that is unexplored is based in the Arctic. You see China, they have 3 icebreakers. The US has 3, one of which is older than 50 years old. Russia has around 45, 3 of which are or more are nuclear powered. So you're looking at that. Then as well, Russia and some of the people, they have, especially Russia, nuclear weapons in the Arctic too. The US and Russia are very close there. Of course, you can literally walk if it's frozen from one place to another without any border protection, I don't believe. So, if we look at the future of energy in the Arctic, I know with the current administration they want to invest more into creating their own ships, etc. Do you have any perspective on that you would like to share?
It's been some time since I looked at Arctic energy issues. I used to follow issues in Greenland actually quite closely. And the Danish oil and natural gas companies' relationship with Greenland and oil production and its relationship to sovereignty and so forth. But it's not easy to work up there. And you think like the Russians have had some success in the north. The Norwegians have. When we were talking in the mid 2000s about peak oil. Yes. That was like the thing that everybody, and then that has now evolved. That was about peak oil supply, but it was peak oil. I don't know if you even know. It's been so long ago. I don't know if you know. It was the idea that oil production had peaked, or was shortly about to peak. But that was easy oil, right? That was like, the big fields in Saudi Arabia. The big fields in the United States, this was easy oil where it was not tremendously difficult to get to. And the concern was that we're going to have to be going deeper and into more hostile, but physically hostile, not above ground risk, but just
would Venezuela count within that as well?
Venezuela was kind of in that because it's largely like it's almost like the tar sands production in Canada, right? It's almost like a mining operation more than. I got excited when the issues in Venezuela arose, and I was reading something and diluent, that came up. The fluid that makes oil, like heavy oil, flow more easily in pipelines.
Yes.
We used to have these discussions about it 20 years ago. And so there it is, it's back as a national security concern. But it was really about Brazilian deep water, offshore deep water, Gulf of Mexico deep water, like you saw Guyana on the horizon. As prices go up, those investments become more attractive. And maybe that comes back, and maybe like some of the challenges we're having right now with prices being up spur greater interest in the Arctic. I just think it's going to be a challenge to see, large-scale production coming from these really physically demanding and hostile territories, plus all these attendant geopolitical and above-ground risks. The combination of those, at the same time, if the price is right, the price is right. Like this is where there's the different companies who have different risk tolerances will go into these different places that they have experience dealing with both above ground and below ground risk. You think about places like Uganda. There are these small companies that went in first. Guyana. These sort of frontier producers, these small companies that were independent, willing to take the risk, and then effectively sell to somebody willing to come in and make the bigger investment when the time is right. So the bottom line is, if the money is there, somebody will go. I think it's a tough slog, especially when there are potential alternatives that are easier with fracking and other, if we can actually get a nuclear, it used to talk about fusion, right? Now they were able to get a result at the National Ignition Facility in Lawrence Livermore to actually generate power using fusion. But the joke was always, fusion is the power sources of 20 years from now. It's 20 years away and always will be. But now maybe the promise is getting closer.
All right, so now if you would like to share some advice, especially for those that want to follow your footsteps, you have a great story to tell professionally and personally, so.
Yeah, well, so one thing I would say for people in particular looking to get into intelligence is don't forget the small agencies, the embedded elements. The Department of Energy's intelligence element does remarkable work, has a long heritage going into the Manhattan Project.
Yes.
Treasury, their intel element does some amazing work. It's not easy to get into those organizations. It's not easy to get in the government anymore. But it's not to only be focused on the large agencies. And if you are focused on the large agencies, FBI, CIA, DIA, NSA, there's lots of different kinds of career paths. So there's not just analysts, not just collectors. There's logistics, there's operational support, there's personnel, there's budget. There's all sorts of ways that you can be part of the national security enterprise without necessarily writing the article that goes to the PDB. And maybe that's seen as more prestigious in some ways, but fundamentally, none of that happens if the intelligence community is, in totality, a support element. We are supporting decisions, people making decisions. So always be thinking in the broader context of the entirety of the organization as one big support enterprise to people being able to do the right thing, to make better decisions in support of the country. Yes. The other bit of advice I would give is, and this is maybe a little bit strange, don't be a jerk. What I saw time and time again in government was people just being obnoxious for no other reason than because they could. And what I always tell students, so I used to speak to this group of 150 students that Odie and I would bring to Washington once a year and say, look, you're going to be sitting across the table from somebody who you're currently sitting across the table from in 15 years in a White House meeting. And what you don't want to have happen is for them to be looking at you and say, how do I recognize that person? Oh, that was that guy who was just such a jerk at that meeting at the Hyatt 15 years ago. It's not going to do you any good now. It's not going to do you any good then. And you're going to, all things considered, especially with some of the subject matter areas, the communities can be quite small. You're going to be encountering the same people over and over again. I have one colleague who I worked with in 4 different capacities over 20 years. And I used to tell people, we need to have a principles-based approach, even on like coordinating articles. Principle 1, don't do the right thing. Principle 2, don't be a jerk. And I think of all the things that I've managed to accomplish over time and that I was able to support other people in accomplishing. I'm proud of that work, but I also think of the things that we didn't get done because we just encountered some sort of dumb bureaucratic thing. Not because it was bureaucracy, but because somebody decided to be a problem. So that's what I always tell people. Do the right thing, don't be a jerk. And the last thing I'll add is, this is a little bit of a joke, but only kind of a joke. Be cautious of eating anything at the cafeteria that involves the words curry, jambalaya, gumbo. Nothing against those cuisines, but they're masking leftovers with spices. Stay away from those. Don't be a jerk. Do the right thing.
And stay away from the cafeteria.
No, don't stay away from the cafeteria.
Curry is there.
But just be conscious of heavily spiced foods in the cafeteria.
Well, thank you very much, Manolis. It was a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you.